The National Tax Training Committee, or NTTC, which is a AARP Foundation Tax-Aide group, and the Stakeholder Partnerships Education and Communication, or SPEC office, within the IRS, are emphasizing the need to conduct thorough intake, interview, and quality review processes. Now, everyone should know that we need to do a complete intake and have a properly filled out intake booklet, and that the tax counselor generating the return and the quality reviewer are both supposed to conduct interviews with the taxpayer. But as we discussed in the policies and procedures presentation, there are still issues that are identified every year. This was confirmed, at least to me, while I listened to a presentation on the intake and interview processes that was sponsored by SPEC. Now, at intervals, they asked questions and had the attendees who were VITA and Tax-Aide volunteers respond via automated polling. On some of the most basic issues related to just the intake process, more than 30% of the respondents had the wrong answers. So our focus is on quality site requirement number 2, effectively using Form 13614C, the intake booklet, to provide the best service and quality possible to the taxpayers we support. We want consistent and repeatable intake, interview, and quality review processes. These are 3 separate and distinct processes that must be in place at all of our sites. There are 2 main documents that deal with the intake, interview, and quality review processes. IRS Publication 5838, the Intake, Interview, and Quality Review Handbook, is brand new. It's based on using the intake booklet. It's intended to make the intake, interview, and quality review processes simpler. Publication 5101, which was recently updated, provides basic training in the process. This slide shows the tax return preparation process. The taxpayer arrives and is greeted. The taxpayer verifies identity and provides verification of Social Security number. A review of the intake booklet is conducted with a client facilitator who documents any unresolved questions. At sites where there are no dedicated client facilitators, a tax counselor would perform this process. So the taxpayer would then be interviewed by a tax counselor who would resolve any remaining tax-related questions. The returns, federal and state, are then prepared. A quality review is conducted by a second tax counselor who prints the returns. The taxpayer meets with the quality reviewer who interviews the taxpayer and walks through the returns, providing an explanation of the results and answering any remaining questions that the taxpayer may have. Taxpayers are then provided with a physical copy of their return, initializing next to the bank account information if requesting a direct deposit or direct debit, and provides approval to electronically file their returns by signing Form 8879, which both taxpayers must sign if it's a joint return. The taxpayer's documents are returned to the taxpayer, and the returns are electronically filed in accordance with the site's policy for e-filing, although in some cases it may be necessary to file a paper return. So the first 2 boxes in yellow represent the steps in the process where taxpayers are interviewed. The last box in yellow is where we return all the documents to taxpayers. This is a slide the NTTC uses to show the steps of the tax return process. They don't consider the filing step to be part of the process they're responsible for, so I added the e-file return box. We're required or expected by Tax-Aide to e-file within 24 hours of the taxpayer signing. At our site, we file returns as soon as possible after the taxpayer has signed the 8879 form. Normally a return will be rejected pretty quickly if there's an issue. It's always better to address and resolve any reject issues as quickly as possible. Usually we can resolve issues like incorrect PIN number or employer identification number on the same day a return is rejected. Purple boxes are steps in the process where taxpayers are involved in addition to the interviews. So we're going to explore the intake, interview, and quality review processes in more detail. The discussion will include responsibilities of all of our volunteers, but I'd like to start off by clearly identifying the responsibilities of our client facilitators, some of whom are hopefully viewing this presentation. My first year volunteering was as a client facilitator, so I have an appreciation for the very important role that they perform, which includes, along with our greeters, the function of making first contact with taxpayers. We're going to discuss responsibilities in the next few slides, so I wanted to clearly identify responsibilities that client facilitators may have. At some of our sites, there are no client facilitators, or only on some shifts. So this is a list of potential client facilitator responsibilities. Forgive me for the full print. The specific tasks client facilitator may be responsible for are up to the local or site coordinator. So welcoming taxpayers and ensuring they're helped in appropriate order and checked off an appointment log, which we do at our site, and it's by appointment only, or sequenced on the site sign-in sheet for walk-ins. Verifying that taxpayers have correct identification documents. Ensuring each taxpayer has brought the correct forms and documents required to accurately complete their return. And in bold, determining with assistance of a tax counselor or coordinator when a taxpayer's return is outside of scope. Again, all tax-related issues should only be addressed by a tax counselor. Ultimately, the decision to turn away a taxpayer should be up to the local or site coordinator. They should also be the person who informs the taxpayer that they need to seek support elsewhere. Assisting taxpayers in filling out portions of the intake booklet and other required papers. The client facilitator will not address tax questions. Now, unless they happen to be certified as a counselor for the given tax year they're working. Keeping information such as waiting time flowing to the taxpayers or in the waiting area, distributing any appropriate literature to taxpayers, adhering to the program policies and procedures, working well with diverse populations, and treating taxpayers and other volunteers with respect. Now, it would be great if we had a standard process or maybe a benchmark against which we could compare our process. Well, it turns out that the Tax-Aide program has created what are called gold standards for intake, interview, and quality review. So before we go any further, it might be the perfect moment to take a look and see what, in the Tax-Aide program's opinion, we should be trying to use as our measure of what I'll call process goodness. This is not an eye test. You can find and view the gold standard covering the intake and interview processes via the link at the bottom of the slide. I just wanted to quickly cover the highlights. Note that the intake process steps shown here can be performed by a client facilitator or a tax counselor. As was just mentioned, at some sites we might not have any client facilitators, which means the process is performed by a tax counselor. Assist the taxpayers in filling out the intake form by answering any questions they may have and asking any clarifying questions you may have. For providing worksheets, at our site we provide taxpayers with two of these sheets, the self-employment and itemized deductions, so they can fill them in advance of their appointments. Now, absolutely remember to explain the 3 consent forms to the taxpayers. It's more important that they understand what the consents mean rather than whether they answer yes or no to each consent. Will a refund be deposited? If so, to what account? Will amount owed be debited automatically? If so, from what account? We'll see the Tax-Aide out-of-scope document a little later, but consult with a local coordinator for any potential scope issues. Here are the gold standards for the interview process. I'll walk through these pretty quickly as we're going to explore these in more detail later in this presentation. First, verify in the intake booklet that all questions in parts 1 through 5 are complete and any unsure answers are addressed and changed to yes or no. The questions answered as yes have corresponding tax information. For example, wages and salary, form W-2. Well, how many jobs, meaning how many W-2s did you have last year? So complete the to be completed by the certified volunteer preparer shaded area for any persons that are listed in that area. Ask the taxpayer if they owned any digital assets, such as virtual currencies like Bitcoin. If the answer is yes, ask if they had any transactions they either bought or sold with the digital assets in the past year. Before beginning to input information in a tax layer, ensure a return is within scope. Check codes on forms like W-2 and the 1099-Rs. Make sure that the return is in scope, and consult with the local coordinator if the return appears to be out of scope. Here are the remaining steps in the interview process. We're going to cover these in more detail, so we'll go through them quickly here. Review all supporting documentation provided by the taxpayer to ensure that all documents belong to the taxpayer and are for the current year. Review the taxpayer documents for any adjustments, deductions, or credits they may be entitled to. If it appears the taxpayer doesn't have sufficient deductions to itemize, then document that fact on the intake booklet for the quality reviewer behind you. If any prior year income sources aren't included, like pensions in the current year, then confirm the taxpayer if they're missing or are no longer applicable. And you would expect that a pension being paid out for a number of years would continue being paid out. Make filing status and dependency determinations by using the resource tools, mainly the qualifying child or relative resource tool, that 8-page document that we have, and the publication 4012. Explain the tax preparation process and encourage the taxpayer to ask questions throughout the process. And exercise due diligence by asking probing questions like, do you have any other income? We need to be organized and start with the basics. In order to best ensure a consistent outcome, we need a repeatable process. Here are the intake process steps. The first few steps are normally performed by greeters for greeting taxpayers and client facilitators. Again, if no client facilitators are available, tax counselors are responsible for the entire intake and interview process. As part of this process, we'll interact directly with individual taxpayers. Remember, we aren't adversaries. The taxpayers are here for our support, and we're here to provide support as best we can. In general, engage the taxpayers. Speak clearly, allowing the taxpayer to fully respond to any questions and ask questions to help clarify the taxpayer's situation. If you aren't sure of something, don't be afraid to say, let me check that for you. A client facilitator should never answer tax questions, like, can I claim my brother Jimmy as a dependent? Or is the unemployment I received last year taxable? One of my favorites is always, I didn't need to file taxes for the last 5 years, and nothing's changed, so I don't need to file this year either, right? Now, they may not need to file, but they may want to, especially if they're eligible for credits they might receive. We had a couple who said they didn't need to file, and they were right, but they were entitled to a tax credit of $1,200 and had been entitled to the same credit for years. We were able to file for 3 years of tax returns, and they received about $3,500. So only certified tax counselors should be answering tax-related questions, so forward all questions to them. By the way, the person in charge of the site, be they a local coordinator, site coordinator, or shift coordinator, might not be a certified tax counselor, in which case they shouldn't be answering tax questions either. Introduce yourself. Ask if the person's there to have the taxes done. If they just need to ask questions or have another item to discuss, refer them as per your site's policy. I've met with taxpayers who want to see if a return they've generated is correct or to ask a specific question. My policy, and that should be yours as well, is that we don't check to see if a taxpayer's return is correct unless we're preparing the return, and we're going to e-file it. If they have tax law questions, at our site, they're asked to wait until a tax counselor is available to answer them, and we have no problem with that. And by the way, all sites should be tracking any questions they receive from taxpayers who don't have their taxes prepared by Tax-Aide. At the end of each tax season, we're asked to provide the number of questions received as part of our closeout process. So tax counselors should make sure that any questions from people who are not looking to have their taxes prepared by Tax-Aide are made known to the site coordinator. And now, the worst of the worst. I've encountered a couple of taxpayers who set up appointments, had our volunteers prepare and review their returns, only to say at the end, oh, I just wanted to see if you'd find the same result as me. I prepared my own return. I'm going to file on my own. They expected to receive a copy of the return, and they were sent away disappointed. Explain the overall process to the taxpayer, letting the taxpayer know that the first step will be to check on positive identification and Social Security number. That'll be followed by a review of their intake booklet. Ideally, taxpayers would have filled out the form to the best of their ability before arriving at the site. Now, that's if the site has set up appointments. At a site accepting walk-ins, this may not be the case. So at our site, we only provide tax preparation assistance by appointment. Now, at the time they set up an appointment, taxpayers are told to pick up a packet at least a day before their appointment and fill out all forms that apply to this situation. So the package includes the intake booklet, a Massachusetts intake form, a self-employed Schedule C worksheet, an itemized deductions worksheet for Schedule A, and instructions on how to fill out the documents. We'll be looking at these documents in just a bit. We also contact taxpayers to remind them of their upcoming appointments and remind them they need to pick up their packages, have the documents filled out when they arrive for their appointments. So despite all our efforts, there's still a few taxpayers who forget to fill out the intake form or lose them. For our new volunteers, please know that you'll encounter a few taxpayers who honestly need a lot of help in filling out the intake booklet. In those cases, a little patience and focused assistance goes a long way. Next, taxpayer documents are organized, and I'll provide a recommended order of documents in a little while. Okay, the first step is to verify the identity of the taxpayer. Two forms of identification are required, a photo ID and a Social Security number or ITIN, individual taxpayer identification number. So Social Security numbers can be provided via a Social Security card, a Social Security benefit statement, or a prior year's return. If no forms of taxpayer identification are presented or anything you see is questionable, let the local coordinator know. So the taxpayer may be told to come back later or to reschedule when proper identification would be available. So as a local coordinator, I've allowed the tax return process to move forward when only one spouse was in attendance and properly identified. However, taxpayers in this situation were told that their returns would not be filed until the other spouse was properly identified. Since both spouses must provide signed approval for Tax-Aide to submit their returns, that's to e-file them, the spouse identification check can be delayed until that time. At our site, we only prepare returns by appointment, which fill up quickly. If we sent people home without starting their returns, it would create scheduling issues. So no matter what, always leave the decision on whether a taxpayer's return will be prepared or not to the local coordinator. So if a person's married but filing separately, we need the Social Security number of the non-filing spouse. If the taxpayer is married filing separately, and does not know the Social Security number of the spouse, enter the spouse's Social Security number as 111-00-1111. You may leave the spouse's date of birth blank. Now, without the spouse's actual Social Security number, the return must be marked for paper filing. It'll be rejected if filed electronically. Now, the only exception to the ID check is when a taxpayer is, quote, known to the site, end quote, meaning they have had their returns generated at the site in the past, or they're a friend or a neighbor of one of the volunteers. So even if they're known to the site, the final decision on whether to process a return for a taxpayer without proper identification is up to the local coordinator. For ID verification, ask the taxpayer or taxpayers for a photo ID. These are acceptable examples of photo IDs: a state driver's license, a state ID card, or a passport. Verify photo and name. You must verify the identity of both taxpayers for joint returns. We can't process a tax return for an adult who's not present and therefore can't be properly identified. Examples are an adult who brings in paperwork for a parent or an adult child. So any issues with proper identification should be brought to the attention of the local coordinator for resolution. We had a situation where a taxpayer lost his wallet and had not received a replacement license. However, he had been a neighbor of one of our tax counselors for many years, and we had filed his taxes for several years. In this case, as we knew who he was, we processed his tax return. Again, the decision was the responsibility of the local coordinator, that's me, and remember that the photo ID must be original, no copy on a phone. The Social Security card can be a copy shown on a phone, but not the photo ID. Next, ask to see the taxpayer's Social Security card and Social Security information for any dependents. Taxpayers will sometimes provide a Medicare card instead. While older Medicare cards may use the taxpayer's Social Security number as a member identification number, newer Medicare cards no longer use Social Security numbers. Here's what a real Social Security card looks like. Some of the cards you might see are pretty old and may not look like this. I've seen an original Social Security card from the 1930s that looked like a piece of old newspaper. It was one of the first Social Security numbers ever issued. Though if a taxpayer can provide Social Security card images on a smartphone, as I just mentioned, they're acceptable, providing the local coordinator agrees. If a taxpayer does not have a Social Security card, ask them if they have a Social Security benefit statement. Although the last 6 digits in box 2 of the form shown here are X'd out, the full Social Security number is displayed on real Social Security benefit statements issued by the government. And if the taxpayer doesn't have a Social Security card or a Social Security benefit statement, they may use a prior year's tax return to verify their Social Security number. However, if the prior return was generated by the taxpayer, check with your local coordinator to see if this is acceptable. The taxpayer may show you an ITIN, which is an individual taxpayer identification number. That's also acceptable. A taxpayer may be represented by a person who's been assigned power of attorney privileges for the purpose of having their tax returns generated and filed. They should have a form they've signed that grants them power of attorney, such as an IRS Form 2848 shown here. The person serving as the legal representative must provide a valid photo ID. Please be aware that power of attorney does not apply once a taxpayer dies. Only individuals who have been authorized by the courts and possess proper paperwork should be filing for a deceased taxpayer, unless the person filing is a spouse. If someone has power of attorney, raise it to the local coordinator. Now we need to begin the process of collecting and organizing taxpayer information, which will allow our tax counselors to create and file tax returns that are correct and complete. Though we uncover this information by conducting interviews with the taxpayers. To aid in this process, every taxpayer is required to fill out and provide Form 13614C, that's the intake booklet, which we discussed just a few minutes ago. The taxpayers must use a current year form for a current tax year return, not one from a prior year. If we're preparing a taxpayer return for a prior tax year, we're required to have the taxpayer fill out a separate intake booklet for that year, and it must be the intake booklet for that year. So no using a 2023 intake form for 2022 tax return. The reason is that things do change on the forms from year to year. During the pandemic, one of the questions concerned stimulus payments. If we had generated a return for a year using a later tax year intake booklet, it may have caused issues. So, speaking of issues, our goal is to prepare a taxpayer's return based on a complete and correct intake form based on input from the taxpayer. If a taxpayer refuses to fill out an intake booklet or wants to know why they should, they can be told that collecting the information of the form better ensures the accuracy of their return. If they refuse, they should be told that the IRS requires us to generate returns based on the intake booklet information. So if they don't fill out the form, we're not allowed to generate a return for them, and they should be turned away. Remember, as always, the site coordinator should be the person who informs the taxpayer that they will need to go elsewhere to have their return prepared. So we walk through the form with the taxpayer, asking questions to ensure that all relevant information has been provided. On the first page shown here, in addition to personal information, including address, phone number, and others, verify that fields like citizenship, status, tax-related identity theft, marital status, and dependents are completed. If the taxpayers or the dependents have been the victims of identity theft or issued a PIN, they should provide a PIN valid for the year that the tax return will be filed, not the year of the tax return. So, can anyone claim the taxpayer as a dependent? I've seen a number of tax returns rejected because a child does not check this box and a parent tries to claim the child. So it's particularly important to know the date of divorce if a taxpayer is divorced. At a minimum, we just need the year of the divorce, not the exact date. Now, the reason for needing this is to determine how alimony is treated if alimony is being paid by one former spouse to the other. So information in Part 1 impacts many tax law determinations. For example, when a taxpayer, spouse if married, filing jointly, is a full-time student, it may impact multiple tax law issues such as whether the taxpayer can be claimed as a dependent and if the taxpayer is eligible for certain credits. If a taxpayer, spouse if married jointly, is totally and permanently disabled or legally blind, it may affect multiple tax law issues, including whether the taxpayer can be claimed as a dependent and whether the taxpayer's pension is taxable or not. And if information in the marital status section will help us make a determination about filing status and various credits and deductions. So in Part 2, please note the taxpayer should provide the names of everyone who lived with them during the tax year and anyone they supported financially but did not live with them. We ask for this information to see if the taxpayers have any dependents that they could claim. We'll take a closer look at this on the next slide. When reviewing Part 2 of the intake booklet with taxpayers, always remember to check if anyone lived with them during the year, and also ask if there's anyone they supported during the tax year that maybe didn't live with them. This could be a child away at school or a parent who lives in their own home or retirement facility. For anyone who's identified, have the taxpayer fill in the fields in non-shaded columns A through I. If there are potential dependents listed in this section, the tax counselor generating the return will complete the grayed out section on the right. This will occur during the tax counselor's interview with the taxpayer or taxpayers. If no one listed in this section qualifies as a dependent, the tax counselor should mark a large X through the gray section so the quality reviewer knows that the tax preparer reviewed the potential dependents and determined none were eligible to be claimed by the taxpayer. So, a taxpayer shows up and says she has children living with her and wants to claim head of household. During the course of the conversation, she reveals that she is still married and her husband still lives with her. If you're not a certified tax counselor, which means you're not authorized to resolve issues related to tax law, including dependency issues, you should collect all the facts possible and document them on the intake booklet in the comment section. A certified tax counselor would use this information and any additional information they can capture from the taxpayer to make dependency determinations as to which tax filing status the taxpayer and her spouse, in this case, should use. So, 2 follow-up statements. First, don't be making any decisions unless you're certified to do so. And second, there are areas of the tax law where taxpayers may have options to choose from, like whether to itemize deductions or use the standard deduction, and areas where taxpayers have no choice. As an example, a couple who are still married to each other can't choose to file as single taxpayers. I want to emphasize that what we're doing is providing assistance to the taxpayers in generating and filing their tax returns. It's their return. If they consciously decide not to provide information, like the name of someone who lives with them, that's their decision. I mentioned making comments on the intake booklet. The use of notes in the software application TaxLayer can also eliminate a lot of confusion, not just for the current tax year, but in some instances for returns to be filed a year or more in the future. So use the qualifying child or relative resource tool and or publication 4012 for dependency determinations and to determine filing status. So shown here are the first and last pages. That's page 1 and page 8 of the resource tool. If you are a tax counselor and you've not been provided one, then please speak with your local or site coordinator. For parts 3, 4, and 5 on the intake booklet, verify that a box is checked in every row. If any of the boxes are checked unsure, discuss with the taxpayer in order to change the answer to yes or no. Please remember, if the question relies on tax law, client facilitators should make a note for the tax counselor in the comments section of the intake book. Asking whether a taxpayer has more than one W-2 or for information such as date of divorce does not require a certified tax counselor. And when reviewing this page of the intake booklet, all volunteers, including client facilitators, the tax counselor who prepares the return, and the quality reviewer should ask, did you have any other income? Now, taxpayers may not have reported cash they received, especially some self-employed taxpayers. Now, some taxpayers believe cash they receive that's under a certain amount doesn't need to be reported, or that a state tax refund they received isn't taxable. Whether they're right or wrong in their assumptions depends on the tax law, and it's the responsibility of our certified tax counselors to apply the tax law accurately. So if you're a client facilitator and someone says, I did some carpentry work for my cousin Bill and he paid me $500, do I have to claim that on my taxes? You should just let the taxpayer know that you'll make a note for the counselor who will be preparing their tax return, and they'll provide an answer to the taxpayer's question. Make sure to document the question in the comments section. We'll see on the next slide. And don't be afraid to mark anywhere in the document with useful information. So if they say they earned $9 in interest from a bank, but they didn't receive a tax form, mark the $9 next to the line for interest. Don't be afraid to mark up that document. So questions a tax counsel might ask during their interviews are, I see that you and your husband both worked, yet you didn't indicate you paid any child care expenses for your 3-year-old son. Or, I see that you're over age 65, but you didn't indicate that you received Social Security benefits. Or, I see you answered no to the question, can anyone claim you on their tax return, but since you're a student living with your parents, I'm wondering if they can claim you. Note that the certification level required for each item in parts 3, 4, and 5 are listed as B for basic, A for advanced, and M for military. All of our tax counselors are certified at the advanced level and can prepare and quality review items that are basic and advanced. Normally, our tax counselors are limited to processing returns for rental income of 14 days or less during the tax year. However, Part 3, Item 14 is marked with an M for military. Rental income and expenses are in scope only for military families renting their personal residences. However, military level certification is required. So a tax counselor and a quality reviewer at a site would both need military certification to generate, review, and file a return with military rental income. We'll be discussing the process of organizing taxpayer documents in just a little while. I wanted to mention that a good process to promote order and consistency is to arrange documents as much in line with the intake booklet as possible. Page 3, please note the area highlighted by the red box that deals with refunds and amounts owed. We need to know how a taxpayer will pay for any amount due, or how the taxpayer would like to receive her or his money if due a refund. Taxpayers who wish to perform a direct deposit of a refund or have funds directly debited from a bank account must provide their account information. This is normally provided by providing us with a voided check. If a taxpayer does not provide a voided check, their account information might be found on a prior year's federal or state return. As with providing a valid Social Security number, we need to ensure bank account information is available unless the taxpayer will be paying by check or receiving a refund by check. So check with your local coordinator if the taxpayer wants to use a bank account but can't provide the information during the intake process. This situation was discussed in the presentation on policies and procedures. If a taxpayer, especially one we've supported in the past, is lacking any documentation, I prefer to move forward with generating their return instead of turning them away and asking them to return. They can always contact a bank or other appropriate institution on the phone while the return is being generated to obtain necessary information. So of course, they can always receive a refund or pay a balance due via check using the U.S. Postal Service. It takes longer to receive a refund this way, but their returns can be filed. The demographic questions. This page contains a set of questions about the taxpayer and the taxpayer's spouse if filing jointly, their race, ethnicity, language competency, and more. The data from these questions are used mainly for statistical purposes to apply for grants to fund our free tax assistance service. So if someone asks why we need this information, you'd be telling the truth to say having this information helps to fund our ability to provide tax services for free. You can point out the statement to that effect that's on this page as a red rectangle around it. If a taxpayer refuses to answer, just ask if they would choose the prefer not to answer option. I listened to an IRS presentation where IRS personnel spoke about several instances where taxpayers told volunteers to leave everything blank, including the prefer not to answer box. The direction from the IRS was to leave all boxes empty if that should happen. Now, I would recommend striking through the boxes, all the boxes, so that the tax counselor understands that they weren't just missed. Note the area for additional comments. Client facilitators should use this area to inform tax counselors of any information they may need or any tax-related questions, which should only be addressed by a certified tax counselor. Tax counselors who are preparing the return should also use this area to notify the quality reviewer of any potential issues or additional information that may be helpful to know during the quality review. They should also use the notes in TaxLayer for this purpose. I want to mention the best practice to consider, and that's having a client facilitators, tax counselors, and quality reviewers use different color pens when writing comments on documents such as the intake booklet. Some sites also have each volunteer initial their comments. That's just something to consider. Following the first 3 pages of the intake form is a page with demographic information for AARP Foundation. If these questions have not been answered, just check with the taxpayers to see if they intended to leave them blank. Any questions the taxpayer does not want to respond to should be marked prefer not to answer. If the taxpayer says don't mark any of the boxes, then I would just draw a big X across the entire page so the tax counselor preparing the return knows the taxpayer didn't want any of the boxes checked. Page 5 in the intake booklet provides a high-level description for the taxpayer on the purpose of the intake booklet. It also provides descriptions of each consent, which we're about to discuss. If you're unsure of the purpose of each consent, or if a taxpayer wants to see documentation describing the consents, this would be a good, concise resource to use. At the back of the intake form are 3 consent forms. We'll talk about them individually in just a moment. As a client facilitator or tax counselor, you'll need to be able to explain the purposes of these forms. They must not be ignored. The taxpayers must either accept them or decline them. That's their choice. Now, they must sign each of the forms they accept. If it's a joint return, both taxpayers must agree and sign, or the answer is no. And remember, it's far more important that the taxpayers understand what they're accepting or declining rather than whether they chose to accept it or not. So let's take a look at each of the forms. Global carry forward consent. If the taxpayer has her or his taxes prepared at a Tax-Aide or VITA site 1 year and goes to a different Tax-Aide or VITA site the next year or beyond, the counselors at that site may be able to import basic information such as name, address, date of birth, and some tax forms into the new return and not have to re-enter the information. This definitely helps to save time in the process. If they don't agree to this consent, their information would only be available at the site where their prior year return was processed. When informed of what this consent means, a lot of taxpayers will say, no need, I'm coming back here next year. By the way, one of the poll questions I mentioned earlier asked if the taxpayer must sign the global carry forward consent form. 33% of the responders said yes. The answer is no. Here's the global consent form. Please note in the red rectangle at the top that our services are provided to taxpayers whether they agree to consent or not. Again, they're perfectly free to decline, but they need to understand what they're declining. So global consent allows all Tax-Aide and VITA sites to access basic taxpayer data. There's a date specified in the consent form in the lower red rectangle that provides an expiration of the consent, meaning how long the consent is valid. As an example, this consent form lists November 30th, 2025 as the end date of global consent. The taxpayer signs if they accept and does not sign if they do not accept. If a joint return, both taxpayers must sign, or the answer is no. When a tax return is complete and ready for filing, the demographic information on the intake form and information on the consent forms is recorded by the tax counselor. It doesn't impact the tax return, just captures information for use by the IRS and Tax-Aide. If the consent form is blank, the tax counselor inputting the data can't be sure whether the taxpayer's declined consent or if the interviewer just forgot to check on the consent with the taxpayer. I always take a pen and run a big X across each consent page that a taxpayer has declined. Again, if one taxpayer in a joint return signs the consent and the other does not, the consent is considered as declined. Mark it with an X. Next is a consent to disclose tax return information to VITA TCE and Tax-Aide tax preparation sites. This consent allows taxpayer information to be shared with the Tax-Aide Foundation and is combined with other taxpayer information for the purpose of obtaining grant funding. It's one very important way we're able to provide this service for free. The taxpayer asks which of the three consents he or she should sign. This is the one that means the most to them, as it helps to keep the service we provide to taxpayers free of charge. Here's a copy of the consent to disclose tax return information to VITA TCE tax preparation sites. Consent 3, consent for the AARP Foundation to use select tax return information to send information to taxpayers on other free AARP Foundation programs and services that may be of value to them. These include programs and services dealing with income, hunger, housing, volunteering, employment, and more. Taxpayers should sign this form if they want to allow the AARP Foundation, that's the charitable arm of AARP, to send them information about these free programs and services. This data is not shared with the parent AARP organization or AARP Services Incorporated, which offers health insurance, phone plans, and this does not result in taxpayers receiving any membership marketing or paid offers. Here's a copy of the consent for ARP Foundation to use select tax return information. The intent of the consent is contained in the red rectangle right about in the middle of the document. In conclusion, a taxpayer's signature indicates an agreement with the consent form. Taxpayers can sign one, two, all, or none of the consent forms. No signature indicates no consent. If a joint return, both spouses must sign to approve. Job aids are any tools and guides that provide simple instruction on how to complete a task. They're used to either introduce new steps in a process or to help people remember how to complete tasks more efficiently. And it turns out, no matter what role or roles we play and what functions we perform as Tax-Aide volunteers, there are job aids available that can help us. Each site may use different or slightly different job aids, but I'm going to present job aids that have proved to be very useful in ensuring that our taxpayer data collection is complete. First, we'll discuss the client facilitator checklist. In addition, we'll look at two job aids, the self-employed worksheet and the itemized deductions worksheet that can move the burden of organizing some of the documents from your shoulders to those of the taxpayer and potentially save a lot of time. We'll look at a form that provides information that's of value in generating taxpayers' Massachusetts returns and a form that's generated while preparing a federal return as an aid in preparing and reviewing the taxpayer's state returns. Here's a copy of the client facilitator checklist that we used at our site last year. Note that the very first question is a scope issue dealing with cryptocurrency that if answered yes, would rule the taxpayer's return out of scope for Tax-Aide. Please note that the latest guidance from Tax-Aide is that returns for taxpayers who just hold virtual currency are not out of scope. You may be unsure concerning the correct answer to some of these items, Unless you're certified as a tax counselor for the tax season, understanding what significant medical expenses are is not your responsibility. But if you're a client facilitator and someone mentions they had major surgeries and medical bills during the year, make a note for the tax counselor. Check with your local coordinator to see if a variation of this checklist is used at your site. Taxpayers who are self-employed are allowed to offset earnings with expenses to reduce their taxes, but they're expected to have documentation for all expenses, which may include receipts and/or logs. I've experienced self-employed people who brought in disorganized shoe boxes full of receipts and expected to have volunteers to generate a return. To prevent this from happening, the self-employed worksheet can be used. All self-employed taxpayers are asked to arrange their expenses by category and write the total amounts in the appropriate boxes. This saves a lot of time and frustration for our volunteers. During the intake process, you may also encounter self-employed taxpayers who provide totals with little or no receipts to support their claims. I worked with an individual my first year who had totals for his expenses but no documentation. When asked if he could provide the documentation if requested by the government, he said he could. So we generated his return after documenting that the taxpayer was fully informed, as all taxpayers should be, and understood he needed to be able to produce the documentation if requested by the government. And tax counselors watch out for taxpayers who try to maximize earned income credit by manipulating their business expenses. Note that at the very top of this worksheet are questions that deal with scope. Answering yes to any of these questions would make a return out of scope for Tax-Aide. So if any of these were checked by the taxpayer, they should be referred to the local coordinator. Remember, we always want to identify out of scope issues as early in the process as possible to avoid any unnecessary effort on our part and any waste of time on the taxpayer's part. We absolutely do not want to start entering a return, right, if it's out of scope. Prior to tax law changes in 2017, about 30% of all taxpayers chose to file taxes using itemized deductions instead of the standard deduction. Following those tax law changes, the number of taxpayers who itemized has dropped to about 10%. That percentage may be even less at your site. I know it is at ours. Similar to the self-employment worksheet in the prior slide, the itemized deduction worksheet is an excellent job aid that can be used to minimize time spent trying to organize and total itemized deductions. Again, this places the burden of providing totals by category on taxpayers, not our volunteers. Note, out-of-scope questions are located at the top of the worksheet. I'll say it again. If you believe a taxpayer's return will be out of scope based on these questions, alert the local coordinator who will decide whether it is or not. In addition to information we collect to ensure a taxpayer's federal return is generated correctly, we also collect information from the taxpayers that aids in generating correct Massachusetts returns. Same as the intake booklet, there's a section on this form that asks how refunds and amounts due will be handled, including how bank information is being supplied, voided check, prior return, bank form, such that the tax counselor generating a return knows where to find this information. Please be aware, a deposit slip may not contain correct bank account information and should not be used. If the taxpayer owes the government money, wants to have the money direct debited from a bank account, ask what date they would prefer the debit to occur. The state of Massachusetts requires adults to have health insurance. Health insurance information should be captured in this form. Finally, there's an area to report IRA distributions. Contributions to traditional IRAs in Massachusetts are taxed. Distributions from these IRAs, up to the amount of the taxed contributions, are not taxed. So if a taxpayer receives distributions from one or more IRAs, we need to determine how much of the distribution might be tax-free on the Massachusetts return. We're not expecting client facilitators to work any numbers in the bottom section. My recommendation would be just to check which box applies and leave the rest to a tax counselor. So if the taxpayer received IRA distributions during the year, ask the question and mark the appropriate box. On page 2 of the Massachusetts intake form are areas to collect information on any estimated taxes that's federal and state, paid for the tax year. There's a standard rental deduction for anyone who pays rent in Massachusetts. Make sure to ask if taxpayers rent or own a home and record the rental amount in the area within the middle red box. Many of our taxpayers are 65 and older and rent or own a home can qualify for what's called a Massachusetts Senior Circuit Breaker credit. Information provided in the bottom red box is used to determine whether taxpayers qualify for this credit. So people who rent can qualify for both a rental deduction and the Senior Circuit Breaker credit as a renter. So other information we'll not discuss in detail, such as gambling losses and college tuition, is also collected on this page. Shown on the slide are page 1 on the left and page 2 on the right of the Massachusetts Intake and Manual Entry Worksheet. This is a critical document in promoting efficiency in the tax preparation process and reducing angst and animosity amongst the volunteer staff. This document is filled in by the tax counselor who's generating the return. This information is passed on to the return quality reviewer along with a complete package of taxpayer forms, intake booklet, and various worksheets. The tax return preparer uses this document while generating the federal return to keep track of the manual entries needed to prepare the Massachusetts return. The more common items that are counted here include mass bank interest, tax-exempt pensions, rent paid, and senior circuit breaker information. Now, this information also provides the quality reviewer with a check to make sure that she or he doesn't miss any items that need to be entered in the Massachusetts return and that the values of those items matches the tax return preparer's numbers. So we require one of these forms to be filled out with each and every tax return. Now, forget to generate one of these forms, and those happy quality reviewers we all know can sometimes turn a little not so happy. Now let's discuss arranging the documents. Our goal is to try to arrange all similar documents together. Recommended document order. This is a document from 2021, but still serves the purpose. Recommend placing the intake booklet on top, then the client facilitator checklist, and the Massachusetts intake form, and any other worksheets that may have been generated. Next are income documents. For income, if the taxpayer has a Social Security, that's an SSA 1099 benefits form, place that first, as it provides tax counselors with the taxpayer's Social Security number in case they need it. Next, group deductions, then healthcare forms, federal and state, which would include any health forms like health savings account forms. Now in 2021, we're dealing with pandemic stimulus payments and corresponding letters for credits that were being issued. If there are any similar letters or any other federal documents that might impact the taxpayer's return, place them here. Next would be Massachusetts documents related to the senior circuit breaker. That's real estate taxes and water sewer payments and rent paid. We would need to know the name and address of the landlord, the person's landlord. And finally, the prior year's tax return, if it's available. When organizing documents, make sure they're for the current tax year. Taxpayers will sometimes include prior year tax documents. This document would have been included in tax return for tax year 2022. In our upcoming tax season, documents should state they're for tax year 2023. Although not pictured in this slide, pay close attention to the state section on W-2 forms. The form may be for income earned in another state, such as Rhode Island. Unless we've been certified to prepare returns for states outside of Massachusetts, we should not be generating returns for those states. Now, the lettering is sometimes very small, which makes it easy to miss these. Now, ask the taxpayer if they have their prior year return. Having the prior year return will help tax counselors and reviewers ensure that there are no missing documents. As an example, if a taxpayer had a W-2 for wages earned the year before, but no W-2 in the current year, or 3 retirement income forms one year and only 1 the next. Taxpayers will often provide documents that are not required. Examples are yearly Social Security statements, pictured on this slide, monthly bank and mortgage statements, credit card payments, and monthly or quarterly statements from brokerage companies. Place all of these documents behind the actual tax documents. All right, we talked about it already, but I'd like to reinforce the need to be aware of scope. What's inside scope for Tax-Aide and what's outside scope for Tax-Aide. These two documents can be referenced to help determine whether a return is in scope or out. The first is the one-page Tax-Aide form C2467 that lists what is in scope on the left and what's out of scope on the right. This form should be posted in the area where the intake process is performed. At our site, we have this form posted on a big poster board. So the scope manual on the right should be referenced by tax counselors when they need to make a determination on scope. Now, any potential scope issues should be brought to the attention of the local coordinator for a final decision. Now let's take a quick look at quality review. We said enough about intake and interview. Now let's take a look at the quality review process, a process that will be performed by a different tax counselor than the one who prepared the return. There's also a gold standard for the quality review process, which is described in IRS publication 5838. The quality review method that the site uses depends on the site size and the number of experienced volunteers available. There are two acceptable quality review methods. There, designated review is a preferred quality review. It uses a designated quality reviewer. It's a volunteer who is dedicated to reviewing returns prepared by other volunteers at the site. These volunteers should be detail-oriented, experienced counselors who are knowledgeable about in-scope tax law for Tax-Aide. The other acceptable quality review method is peer review, when a designated quality reviewer is not available. It says that counselors can review each other's returns. So self-review, that is quality reviewing a return you prepared, is not an acceptable quality review method. Here are the gold standards for quality review. The review is done by examining the information input into tax layer by the preparer. The intake booklet is reviewed with the taxpayer. All questions are answered or declined, and all unsure boxes changed to yes or no. The AARP Foundation questions are answered, and consent forms are understood and signed as necessary. Now, additional probing questions are asked to ensure accuracy and completeness, including some general questions like, do you have any more income? Are there any other dependents that you can claim or believe you could? Notes are made on the intake booklet of new or different information that's gained. Electronic notes can be placed into tax layer as appropriate. In bold, review the NTTC modified publication 4012 tab K for the IRS list of required elements in a quality review. It's known as the quality review checklist. We'll talk about more. The quality review results can be reviewed with preparing counselor for training purposes. So quality site requirement number 2 requires that all tax returns must be quality reviewed to ensure accuracy, and that every item on the quality review checklist, which can be found, as we just mentioned, in IRS publication 4012 tab K and publication 5838, must be addressed while reviewing the intake booklet, all supporting documents, return preparer comments, and the completed tax return. Now, the taxpayer must be available to explain any discrepancies the quality reviewer may discover. Now, I've included the quality review checklist on the next slide. I'm not going to cover the list, as there are 19 items on the list. But one example is the requirement to verify that the number for federal income tax withholding is correct, which is one of the most common errors found on inaccurate tax returns. Now, we must also verbally advise taxpayers before they sign the tax return of their responsibility for information on their return. On this slide are the quality review checklist items. This list can be found again in publication 4012 tab K and IRS publication 5838. These 19 items are required for a proper quality review, and that's mandated by the IRS and Tax-Aide. We're close to finishing. There are 2 basic methods to quality review a return tax layer. Option 1 is the strongly encouraged method. Option 1 is use the quality review print set. So you interview the taxpayer and review the intake booklet, open the quality review print set, review each page to verify the information on each page is correct. If an error is found, note it for later correction or go back to the Tax Layer tab, open the return to make the correction, then go back to the already open quality review print and continue reviewing the return. And then complete the quality review return by checking the state return. So let me show you how to access the quality review print set if you don't know how. It's a very poor diagram, but here's how you open the quality review print set. Number one, in the selection bar for the return you're reviewing, click on the printer drop-down arrow. It's in the upper left picture. The red arrow is pointing to the printer drop-down arrow. And then a window number 2 will open that includes a number of print options. Select the option for quality review. The quality review tax return print will appear. If the taxpayer has requested a direct deposit, the bank routing and account information will be available right below the tax return summary information, which is in picture number 3. The routing number and account number are in the red box. This is quality review option 2. Review each data entry page within the return. Interview the taxpayer, review the intake booklet, open the return to the 1040 view, and verify the return appears correct and personal information matches the intake booklet. Then navigate to the basic information page and verify information on pertinent pages is correct. Navigate to the main income page and open each income form to verify information. Then do the same for forms and schedules on the deductions and other applicable pages and e-file information. And you complete the quality review by checking the state return. So basically this approach is to review every entry in the system against the intake form and supporting documents. When you click on the Federal button in the navigation pane on the left, you can see the tree of all forms used. Just click each form and review the entries. Coming to the end, what's a quality review? Well, the quality reviewer is actually repeating everything that the intake counselor did, with the exception they're not doing the data entry. They start from the beginning with the intake booklet, checking the documents, and checking for scope. So a quality review isn't just a proofreading exercise. It isn't someone sitting down and paging through the tax forms, checking for accuracy, and then being done. If you aren't talking to the taxpayer, it's not a quality review. A second interview with the taxpayer is required. You need to ask questions again. Just because the counselor entered a certain way, for example, did not itemize, you need to verify that's correct. We don't want the initial counselor to lead the process. So the quality reviewer needs to do the review on her or his own while asking questions, if need be, for the counselor. Just like with intake, you need to be organized and follow a process. Use resources like Publication 4012 and the Qualifying Child or Relative Resource Tool. Ask the same questions as though you were conducting the initial interview. Have there been any changes since last year? Do you have any other income? So go through the intake booklet and compare the return to the prior year. If there's a change in refund amount, try to determine why and be ready to provide that information to the taxpayers, because you know they're going to ask why there's a difference, especially if they owe or owe more, or their refund's smaller. If the taxpayer came to your site last year, you can use the comparison tool in Tax Layer, or look at last year's tax return and do proofread the tax forms. And now we'll pause for questions and comments.